One of the biggest problems I see in psychology students is the tendency to ask deep, personal, meaningful, enduring, and all-encompassing questions. Now, from the outset, these might sound like fantastic qualities in a psychology student, but they're troubling qualities if the goal is trying to apply scientific reasoning to the psychological discipline or the field of psychology. Essentialist questions, these super personal, meaningful, enduring, and all encompassing questions, are not falsifiable and they can't be verified using empirical information. They can't be tested. In other words, the strength of an essentialist argument lies in how persuasive it is, or what theories or historical documents, or perhaps which religion it draws on. So the quality of an essentialist argument is unexperimental, it's unscientific. That doesn't mean there aren't facets of validity there, but they're different types of validity than we deal with in science. So what I want to talk about in this lecture is the difference between an essentialist question and an operationalist question, and then outline some of the basic parameters of operationalist questions. In the scientific approach to psychology, we want to practice operationist psychology, or employ operationalism and avoid essentialism. So let's look at the topic of depression. Depression is a popular topic in psychology because a lot of people are affected by it. In fact, close to 1 out of 3 American adults have experienced depression themselves or are currently experiencing depression. And so of those other 2 out of 3, we can pretty much bet that at least they know somebody who is depressed or interact with somebody who is depressed. So a first-year psychology student, or even a young graduate student, might want to ask a question such as, so what does depression really mean? And how can we get to the root of it? How can we figure out how to prevent it from ever happening again so that no one will ever be depressed? It's a laudable goal. However, it's not the kind of approach, it's not the kind of goal that a scientific psychologist can make as their own. Even an entire career devoted to studying depression is limited to chiseling out a specific area, maybe a certain type of factor that's been associated with depression, and trying to understand that as well as possible, and doing so in an empirically testable way, so that everything that has been discovered, everything that has been shown to be the case about that factor of depression has all the evidence to support it. And so it's making these little tiny baby steps towards the growth and development of, in this case, psychopathology, or the psychopathology of mood disorders. This might strike you as horribly upsetting. Perhaps there will be elements of depression that you experience as a result of this. So psychology won't be these grand, overarching questions of human meaning. They're much smaller, measurable, systematically explored, but very tiny establishments of understanding. And so the steps forward in the scientific practice of psychology are very small. They're not these giant steps, which is kind of what I think a lot of students want to see. They want to know that they're making these great strides, but the strides in science are relatively small, unfortunately. So why are essentialist questions a problem for the scientific practice of psychology? Well, ultimately, there isn't empirical evidence that can support them. An essentialist study might be a philosophical one, talking about, say, the history, the etymology of a word, how it's been employed. So this would be a semanticist might look at, or a philologist might look at the word depression and when it first emerged and the context in which it emerged, and kind of talk about linguistically what does depression represent and how is it used as a concept, and how did that use of the concept kind of change people's experience. And so we're looking back at something and trying to fit an explanation over existing data or existing evidence that's out there that's already happened. Remember, in the practice of psychology, we're not looking backward, we're looking forward. Um, Being able to explain why something happened is after the fact, it's ex post facto, and there's no predictive value in explaining something that's already happened. The real predictive value of experimental science is being able to make a prediction about what will happen given certain factors. And so in the scientific practice of psychology, we look forward. If we look backward, and this is important. I'm not trying to discount the essentialist study of mood disorders, but I think philosophers and anthropologists and historians are better suited to that. Even poets and artists, kind of talking about how it might be experienced or being able to replicate the experience for somebody else. There's value there, or how to demonstrate it through an artwork or a novel. In the practice of science, we want to be able to predict, for example, what factors may influence depression, what might increase or decrease it. We might even say, in some kind of extreme cases, making an argument that maybe factor A causes depression, or will definitely increase depression, or factor B will decrease depression, and we can design experiments to test it. So essentialist questions, while important, are unfortunately off the table for scientists, and so scientific psychologists or experimental psychologists can't ask them. So if they can't ask these grand, sweeping, enduring, and deeply meaningful questions, what sorts of questions can they ask? And the answer there is operationist questions. An operationist question limits itself to what can be measured, what can be empirically observed in a systematic way, and therefore what is measurable, what is testable, and what is falsifiable. And so in the practice of psychological science, you don't see all-encompassing explanations for why something happens. It is proposals or hypotheses of what variables affect other variables. And so in order to talk about the interaction between variables, and a simple way to demonstrate that might be billiard balls on a pool table. So like the cue ball hits the 8 ball and makes the 8 ball go into the corner pocket. So we're talking about two balls that hit each other, and then there's an interaction that's predictive. In fact, you might say 8 ball corner pocket, and so if you hit the cue ball and the 8 ball and it goes into the side pocket, well, then you didn't have a very good prediction there. In the practice of science, you make predictions about the interaction between variables. I propose, or it's my hypothesis, that drinking too much coffee in the afternoon increases someone's anxiety. And so I'm not looking back at, oh, I was really anxious today. Well, I had 8 cups of coffee. Maybe that's it. That's a ex post facto explanation. And it's not that valuable in science because we can attribute all sorts of things to the anxiety that was exhibited. Maybe it was, oh, well, it was really sunny that day, so maybe it was the sun. Or you didn't eat anything. Maybe it was that. Or maybe you're suffering from acute cardiac episode. Maybe it was that, and so on. There's no end to the kinds of explanations we can give. But if we're making a hypothesis about a single variable, coffee, and its influence on mood disorder, anxiety, then we should be able to test that in order for it to be an operationalist type of question. So notice the operationist question doesn't say this is what causes all anxiety, or this is the meaning of anxiety, or this is what anxiety says about the human condition. It's limited to, I think I have reason to suspect that caffeine, or the caffeine specifically in coffee, will increase the likelihood of someone having or exhibiting anxiety. And so we can actually test that. We can give coffee to 100 people, and half of those people will have decaffeinated coffee, and the other half will have full caffeinated coffee, and we can measure how much anxiety they exhibit. Everyone is drinking coffee, so it's not the act of drinking a hot, dark liquid that tastes like coffee, but it's the presence of caffeine in that coffee. And so then in order to actually measure that at the end, we would have to have some operational definition of anxiety. How do we define it? How can we define it in operational terms so that when we say anxiety, all 100 of us have an agreed upon definition, and that when we see it exhibited in one person and see it missing in another person, we can with reliability say, yes, this person is showing anxiety, this person is not showing anxiety. So it's not just saying, yep, everyone who had coffee is anxious because coffee causes anxiety. They're right. So that's circular reasoning. What I'm doing here is talking about the kinds of questions that operational psychologists ask, and then what goes into those questions themselves. So just to reflect really quickly, essential questions are the deep, enduring, meaningful, and important questions about the human condition, about what something really means, but these aren't questions that scientists are capable of answering, so they don't bother asking them. You might actually see some quantum physicists in particular who write questions about the meaning of life, but note that's not part of their experimental practice. They have these careers devoted to running experiments on electrons, for example, and the predictive ability of determining where an electron is in a particular moment, but then also writing essays about what life really is. Like Schrodinger has a book called The Meaning of Life, or What is Life? And while those are very interesting books, they're essentialist questions. And if you want to practice or apply scientific reasoning to psychology or any experimental discipline, you can't ask them, unfortunately. Or you can ask them on your free time. It's not considered part of the scientific practice. So let's say you have accepted that. And if you want to ask essentialist questions, do that in philosophy, do that in anthropology, do that in maybe creative writing. There are communities devoted to asking those questions, and there are rules for how to ask them and so on, and you can learn those rules so that there's some accountability there. But in the scientific disciplines or in the STEM disciplines, you have to limit yourself to operationist questions. So what is an operationist question? Well, the basic unit of an operational question is the operational definition. So to think like a scientific psychologist, you have to start thinking of every concept in psychology operationally. So let's talk about depression. In order for you to define depression operationally, you have to do it in empirically measurable terms. This means that depression can't be a vague feeling. It has to be a specific feeling if you're going to work with feelings. It has to be identifiable. It has to be recognizable by persons who are experiencing it. It has to be maybe scaled or provided in units that, again, are recognizable. Depression can't be operationally defined as feeling bad. It's like, well, what does that mean to feel bad? So what does this look like for, say, depression? If you want to study depression operationally, you have to let go of the question, well, what is depression really? What does it mean? What's the root cause? And instead, you have to come up with some agreed upon definition of what it is, what depression is, and that definition has to be measurable. There has to be some scale on which there is wide agreement about how to place people on that scale. And so we've talked about systematic empiricism, and the systematic part of that is, or rather the empiricism part of that is, it has to rely on our five senses. And so we might see someone that seems depressed, and so what we're seeing is evidence of their depression, but we need to be able to talk about what we've seen in systematic terms. And a good way to think about the systematicity is that if I came up with a scale for interpreting how someone looks, and I gave that scale to 10 people, and they're all able to kind of like understand that scale and use it to make the same analysis on the same person, so everyone finds them to be an 8 out of 10 on a scale of depression, then we know that we would have a systematic way of viewing depression. And that approach is precisely what leads to an operational definition of depression. So an operational definition has to be measurable. and it has to be measurable in a systematic way, so that if multiple people all use the same measure, that they would have the same answer or arrive at the same result. An essentialist definition of depression might be just not feeling like yourself. I can understand why that might fit. I can maybe recognize that, yes, sometimes if I'm depressed, I just don't quite feel like myself. But how would a scientist come along who doesn't know you be able to look at you and say, you know what, you don't seem like yourself today? In other words, we're talking about some quality of being human that is not empirical. It is maybe fundamental to being human or some existential type of question, but it's not operational. A simple operational feature of depression might be sadness, as evidenced by frowning a lot, or sadness as evidenced by not smiling, or not laughing at a joke, or dragging one's heels, or not eating very much, or not going out with friends when that's what you normally do, or sleeping too much, or spending all day in bed. Notice I'm listing symptoms that appear in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders for depression. The symptoms of mood disorders are operational features of the mood disorders. So anxiety, panic disorder, even, there's, I think, 20 different forms of depression. Each of them have their own set of symptoms or features that differentiate it from other forms of depression. None of these are the person just doesn't feel like themselves. Maybe added together, we can make a case that they don't feel like themselves, but that's an essentialist way of looking at it. In order to keep it operationist, we need to stick with things that are empirically observable and in such a way, or observable in such a way, that we can be systematic about that. So in a depression inventory, there would be a bunch of questions about sleep habits, because part of the operational definition of depression is that someone's sleep habits change. Some sleep more, some sleep less, but all of them report unsatisfying sleep, or problems with sleep, or changes to their sleep habits. Therefore, operationalized, depression is a change to someone's sleep habits. Now, does that mean depression and sleep are the same thing? Well, not exactly. Does it mean that depression is nothing more than changes to sleep? Is it essentially sleep loss or sleep gain? Again, no, we're not really asking questions about the underlying meaning of depression. We're just trying to come up with an operational definition that there's agreement on, that we can all kind of say, yeah, that fits. And yes, I can easily determine whether or not I or somebody that I'm evaluating has had a significant change in their sleep patterns. Is the meaning of depression then to be found in sleep? No, it's what we're talking about is a empirically observable and systematically empirically observable feature of depression that there's some agreement on. If we wanted to be really simple and say that depression is frowning, then we can make a scale of the extreme forms of frown. So there's like the openly crying, and then there's like the sad and forlorn, and then there's kind of like the passive, and then there's maybe like pleasantly happy, and then there's like full smile, and then laughing. And then we can put someone, if we watched a movie of 100 different faces, then 8 of us, we could use our scale and correctly identify where on the scale they lie, and there'd be some agreement between our scales. And so yes, we've come up with a systematic way of determining how happy or sad someone is, simply based on what they're doing with their face. Now, I think rightfully you would see holes in this for how well smiling or frowning approximate happiness or sadness or depression. But what I'm trying to show is this is a highly operationalized way of looking at something like depression. When we do this, we always leave something out. There are 9 symptoms of depression, and surely there are features of depression, as you or someone you know may have experienced it, that aren't found in those, and there might be some essential meaning of depression that those 9 symptoms don't account for. That's okay. Operational psychology accepts that as one of the trade-offs of being able to ask testable questions. So in operationalism, you're able to I don't know why this I don't know if you'll be able to see those fireworks. That's embarrassing. Um, Operationalist psychologists accept the trade-off of not being able to ask those deep, enduring, essentialist questions in order to have the benefit of testability and what we'll see as reliability and validity. So the first part of operationalist psychology is the use of operational definitions. And so an operational definition lets go of what something means down its most basic element and focuses instead on what can be systematically, empirically observed in such a way that approximates that essential meaning but is still empirically observable in a systematic way. So we're talking about measuring something. It could be measuring behavior, it could be measuring thoughts in a self-report kind of questionnaire. Usually it's measuring something that can be seen or measured directly on the body. So by way of fMRI, for example, so a brain scan or a blood test or even like body temperature changes or movements. So there's no end to the kind of things that can be collected as observations. But again, an operationalist definition relies on those observations alone and not some underlying significance. The next things to think about with operationalism are reliability and validity. So I want to talk about a couple of those. The first thing is reliability, and I've mentioned this before and I've given examples of it before, but reliability is how maybe the level to which multiple raters would agree on an observation. So if something is reliable, I've talked about 8 people using the same scale to evaluate 100 people. If everyone uses the scale identically, so that person 87, all 8 raters give a 4 out of 5 on, then that's perfect reliability. That's called inter-rater reliability. It tells us that the tool that we've designed is good enough that there is agreement on it. So that agreement kind of tells us this isn't in someone's mind, it's actually reliable. It's the result was replicated by 5 people or by 8 different people. I forget what the hypothetical example was. I think it was 8. Reliability talks about the strength of the tool. It also talks about the strength of the observations. So if you were to evaluate a client as to whether or not they're depressed, and then someone else evaluated the same client, you found that they were not depressed, this other person found that they were depressed, then the procedure of evaluation would be unreliable because you guys both got different results. So we might bring in a third person to kind of level that out. There are certain problems with that use of a third rater, but inter-rater reliability is one way of showing the strength of a tool. It also shows another form of reliability would be the same person using the tool multiple times to evaluate a group of individuals. So that's test, retest reliability. Being able to, let's say, use a depression measure on a group of 10 students, and then a week later use the same depression measure on the same group of 10 students. And if you get about the same results, then that tells us that A, you're doing a good job using the tool, and B, depression as measured by the tool is stable. It doesn't get a different answer every day. If it gave a different answer every day, then that might tell you that what you're measuring isn't exactly depression, but some other passing emotional whim. And of course, depression, as it's defined, is more enduring. And so you'd want to be able to find the same thing multiple times. So when we're talking about operationalism, reliability is very important. A good synonym, it's not perfect, but a good synonym for reliable is replicatable or replicable. If something can be repeated and get the same results, then that tells you that the finding was, if nothing else, reliable. Now, another feature of operationism, and this is perhaps more important, but of course they're both important, but the second one is validity. how valid a study is or how valid an observation is. Now, validity trips a lot of people up, but let me go back to the example of depression. What does depression mean is an essentialist question. An operationist question has to come up with some systematically, empirically observable feature of depression, and I gave the example of changes in sleep habits. Now, let's say we define depression as only that. Depression is a significant change in sleep habits, and we would have to define significant as 2 hours or more off of average. So that's big. If 8 hours is average, you're not sleeping 10 hours or more, or 6 hours or less. So that's a really big change. If that's how we defined it, then we would mark or flag someone who's had a 2-hour change in sleep habits as depressed, and someone who has not had a 2-hour change in sleep habits is not depressed. Now, as an endurance athlete, I know that ramping up my mileage, if I go from running 50 miles a week to running 80 miles a week, I'm going to sleep an extra 2 hours a week. Now, there's a physiological explanation for that. It's because my body needs that much more time to recover, and sleeping is the best way to do it. Does that mean that I'm depressed? Well, no. But this measure of depression as 2 hours or more change in sleep habit would flag me as depressed. So you see how my example doesn't actually, it fits the definition, but it isn't depression. It misses the point. In this example, the operational definition of depression would be invalid. It would lack external validity. Yes, it measures something that approximates depression, but no, it sort of missed the point. Operational definitions in psychology will always lack some validity. So what you want to do is get as close as possible. Is the 2-hour change in sleep habits perfect? No. Is it okay? Well, sure, it could be worse. What if we said that depression was tied to height? That would lack entire validity. There's no reason to suspect that depression and height are related. We could collect the data. We could be reliable in collecting height data and having some agreement on how to do that and what it how to do so on a variety of clients or a variety of participants, but it wouldn't tell us anything about depression. In that sense, there would be no external validity in that definition of depression. So the 2-hour change in sleep habits would be more valid. It's not perfect, but it's more valid. So that's external validity. You will always run into that problem when you conduct experiments or when you read data from an experiment. John Watson, the behaviorist, did the famous Little Albert study, and he was interested in whether or not emotions could be learned, or rather emotions were learned. And what he did was scared the hell out of a little infant Albert and said that he had taught Albert to be afraid of mice and Santa Claus and a whole bunch of generalizable stimuli. Now, is scaring the hell out of an infant the same as learning an emotion? Perhaps. It definitely is fear. We could say that he learned to be afraid. But is that the same thing as learning to be happy or learning to be sad or learning to be excited? Those aren't perfect representatives of, or fear isn't perfect representatives of all of those things. Fear is an example of fear. And so did he really show what he set out to show? Well, he did a pretty good job. I think there was a lot of validity, but it wasn't perfect. And since then, we've done a lot better to differentiate the types of emotions in the practice of psychology. At the same time, there were a lot of studies done only on dogs and pigeons and rats, and there's a validity problem because is scaring a dog the same thing as motivating a 5-year-old to learn the alphabet, right? So those studies were generalizable to humans. Even studies of canine fear were experiments to try to generalize that to learning in children. And yes, we could see a line there. There's some validity, but personally, I'd like to see experiments done using children and maybe teaching strategies for how to teach them to learn their alphabet, for example. So there's always going to be some validity issues. If you read a study that says, like study finds students of color more likely to fail mathematics classes or perform more poorly in physics. How do they define students of color? How do they define performance in physics? There are operational definitions in all of these, and you can't just take for granted that when they say students of color, there's some essential meaning they're drawing on. They have to operationalize it. So how did they define it? Did they look at transcripts? Did they look at birth certificates? Did they look at driver's licenses? Like, how did they just look at the students and try to make a judgment call? Did they let students decide it for themselves? How was it defined? How was performance measured? Were there other factors that weren't considered? When you look at variables that are given to you by researchers, keep in mind that they've been defined by the researchers. The operations come from the researchers themselves, so you can review them. Do you agree with their parameters? Did they give definitions that are sound to you? Are they valid? So that's external validity. I probably talked too much about that, but it is an important feature. The other feature with validity is internal validity, and that's simply how well the tool works. Internal validity can be improved by getting a better tool. So a thermometer, for example, with a mercury, where there's the little red line, there's a lot of numbers and notations on one little tiny thermometer, if that's what you're using. Let's say you're using a very tiny one and you can barely see the numbers on there. It's it's somewhere between 97 and 99. But so I can't tell if your temperature is elevated or not because it's so close. But if you had a digital thermometer that goes to 6 decimals, you would have a highly specific temperature, and you could tell the difference between a 1,000th of a degree on a digital thermometer. And so if you trusted that the digital thermometer was accurate and it always gave consistent measurements, which would tell you it's reliable, and it can give you a hyper-specific temperature, then that would have a very strong internal validity in your observations for gathering temperature. Same thing goes for depression. If you ask one question, are you depressed or not? Well, that doesn't differentiate what types of depression there might be exhibited by this person. A 100-item depression inventory can talk about sleep habits, eating habits, social habits, affective habits. What else is important? Just basic mood habits or feelings about life and importance of life, like existential habits. You can go a lot deeper with multiple questions about each of them to have a generalist or a better, more specific assessment about the features of this presenting person's depression, as opposed to a 5-item questionnaire that will give you a ballpark estimate of whether or not they're depressed. That's what happens in the hospital, by the way. If you come in, they'll ask you a couple of questions, but that's not nearly as internally valid as a 100-item questionnaire. Now, most established questionnaires will be around 40 items because who has the time for 100? So internal tests of validity have already been performed on the items of those. So that's for assessment design or inventory design. That's a topic for advanced psychology. So I've talked about reliability, validity, internal and external, and construct validity is how I described external validity. So when I use the word depression and I have a specific definition in mind that determines the type of measurement being used and how to conduct that measurement, that's what we get. If the type of definition I'm using and measure I'm using are good representations of the construct, depression in this case, that I'm interested in, then it has good construct validity and ultimately demonstrates external validity. So those are a lot of important philosophy of science concepts in the practice of psychology.